Hey, Austin and Kellyanne. As I promised, here are a few notes on Geoffrey Chaucer, the Middle Ages, and the Canterbury Tales, which hopefully you have started by now. So, Geoffrey Chaucer was born, we think, in 1343. There weren't a lot of written records at this time period because Chaucer is born and lives during the time of the Black Death, the plague, and he actually writes about that in the Pardoner's Tale, which you will read. We think Chaucer was born in 1343, but again, there's no definite written record of this. We know that he dies in 1400, and he is actually buried in Westminster Abbey in the Poets' Corner. He was the son of a wealthy vintner. His father was a wine merchant. His mother actually came from lower nobility, and so Chaucer lived a pretty cushy lifestyle growing up, and his noble ties actually led to him getting a job as a teenager as a page and a diplomat to several royal households. When he was older, he was a soldier, and he was also a member of an elite group of king's servicemen. And so Chaucer was always around nobility, maybe not directly with kings and queens and such, but he certainly had the opportunity to observe them and to see how they lived, what they ate, how they drank, how they talked. And so you see the influences of this nobility in several of his Canterbury tales. But he also was around, the common everyday man as well. And so we see him as being very well rounded in how people in the Middle Ages would have lived in every rung of that social hierarchy. He primarily was a poet, and we consider him as the father of English literature or the father of modern poetry. And most of his works in his lifetime were very, very popular. After his death, Canterbury Tales is published and becomes really one of the hallmark works of the Middle Ages. He married Philippa Roet, who was a lady in waiting to the nobility, and because his brother-in-law will become John of Gaunt, who is a prince and is in line for the throne of England himself, Chaucer will have a direct link to the throne through his great-grandson. His great-grandson was actually named heir apparent to the English throne, but he actually died in battle, and so he never became king. And so it's interesting to see Chaucer, go from being the son of a merchant up through the ranks in terms of nobility, and then ultimately his own great-grandson was going to be a potential candidate to be the King of England. So that's pretty important. Just shows that Chaucer is a much greater deal than a lot of people realize he is. We actually know far more about Geoffrey Chaucer than we even do about William Shakespeare. There are more written records from Chaucer's time than there were during Shakespeare's, which is very strange. So the Canterbury Tales are what you're reading. And the Canterbury Tales are by far one of my favorite works of literature because they're so diverse and they're so much fun. This was, again, a hallmark for Chaucer's literary career. He started writing the Canterbury Tales in 1387, and when he died in 1400, they were actually unfinished. It's a collection of narrative poems written in Middle English, and they're told from various viewpoints. The tales themselves are told by individual pilgrims who are introduced to you with a general prologue to the tales. And each tale is very revealing of life in the Middle Ages. You see that Chaucer makes some very pointed critiques there on gender studies, on society in general in the Middle Ages, especially in terms of politics and religion. He really tackles religion, and we see this very strong critique of the Catholic Church throughout the Canterbury Tales and the individual pilgrims who are on the trip to Canterbury. So what he does is he gets this big group of pilgrims together. He creates all these characters called pilgrims, and he has them on a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas a Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. And so a pilgrimage was a religious journey made by a group of people to pay homage to saints and to visit the Holy Lands and places that were deemed holy by the church. And a pilgrimage would have been a huge deal. Most people would never have gone on a pilgrimage because they could not have afforded it. Those who could have afforded a pilgrimage would probably have only gone on one, maybe two in their entire lives. And so you have this group of people who are meeting together at the Tabard Inn to embark on this journey together, because in the Middle Ages there's definitely safety in numbers. So all of these individuals are introduced to us through the lens of a general narrator who is Chaucer himself. And each pilgrim has a very distinct title, and it's based upon their job or their station in life. We get a little bit of a physical description of each pilgrim, but then we also get some of their personality traits as well. So the Shrine of St. Thomas of Becket at Canterbury Cathedral was a real pilgrimage destination in Chaucer's day. So the story of St. Thomas of Becket is a really interesting one. Thomas of Becket was appointed to be the Archbishop at Canterbury Cathedral by a good friend of his, a guy named King Henry II. King Henry II put Thomas of Becket in the position of Archbishop basically so that a Becket could be a yes man for him. Henry II was very much like Henry VIII later on. He was very much about doing his own thing and having his own way. And so in putting his friends in high places, he was always able to basically get what he wanted from the Roman Catholic Church. The problem here is that Thomas of Becket, once he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury Cathedral, he begins taking his job very seriously. And so instead of being a yes man for the king, Thomas of Becket actually starts doing what's right. He actually does his job the way that it ought to be done. King Henry II is furious with this. He makes a comment, "Will no one rid me of this pest?" A couple of his bodyguards then go to Canterbury Cathedral and they murder Thomas of Becket on the steps leading up to the altar. And this is going to spark, of course, outrage within the church. And St. Thomas of Becket is then going to be made a saint. He is canonized, and the place of his death actually becomes a shrine, and many people will take pilgrimages there to pay their respects to him. So all of these pilgrims meet up together at the Tabard Inn, which is like a pub / hotel, and Harry Bailey, the host and the owner of the Tabard Inn, decides that he's going to tag along with them and he's going to go on the pilgrimage as well. Now, a pilgrimage would take weeks and weeks to complete, and so you would travel by foot, you would travel by horse, as you see some of the pilgrims do, and you would stop and stay at various inns and taverns along the way. So to pass the time, Harry Bailey says, "Hey guys, I've got this great idea. We're going to play a game. It's going to be a storytelling contest. And each of us is going to tell a story on the way to Canterbury, and then each of us will tell a story on the way back. And when we get back to the Tabard Inn, we will decide who the winner is. Whoever tells the best story is going to win the contest." And he promises them like a free meal and free lodging back at the Tabard. And they figure, why not? Why not? There's nothing else to do on this long journey except drink and talk and pass the time telling stories or maybe singing. And so the contest is going to be well underway the next morning when the pilgrims get up and start their journey. Before we can get into any of the tales, though, we need to understand the people, the pilgrims who are on this trip. So if you look at this, you have a social structure of the Middle Ages. Your top tier is going to be your nobility, as always. We only have a couple members of the nobility on this trip. The knight and his son, the squire, are going to be really our only nobility. There are plenty of wealthy people on the trip, but in terms of actual nobility, the knight and the squire are going to be the only two. The next group you have would be the clergy, and there's a lot of pilgrims on the trip who are members of the clergy. We have the prioress, the pardoner, the monk, the summoner, the nun's priest, the parson, which is like a country preacher, and a friar. Your working class pilgrims on the trip are going to be the doctor, a merchant, the wife of Bath, who is like a seamstress, a clerk who is going to actually be a student. We also call him the student because he's in training to become a clerk. He's not quite a member of the clergy yet, but his family has to have some money in order to send him off to school to be a member of the clergy. We next have someone who's like a lawyer called the sergeant of law, and then we have a character called the yeoman. The yeoman is an attendant to the knight and the squire. So he would carry their weapons, take care of their horses, and those kinds of things. The lower class members are going to be really your working, really working class, the people who are going to be working in the fields, sweating, really having to earn a hard living. You have here the miller, the reeve, which is kind of like a carpenter, a shipman who turns out to be a little bit like a pirate, I guess you could say, a plowman who, of course, is a farmer, a manciple, and then they have a cook with them who will cook their meals at various camping destinations and taverns and such along the way. You'll notice that the names of the pilgrims are basically whatever their jobs are. There are only a few pilgrims who have distinct names, and we'll talk about them later on when we get to their slides. So, who are the individual pilgrims or characters that Chaucer puts on the journey? First, in the general prologue, you're going to meet the knight. The knight is an older gentleman. He has been in a lot of battles. You're going to see in the general prologue basically a litany of all the different battles he's been involved in, all of his honors, everything that makes him stand out as this perfect chivalrous knight. As a matter of fact, the words Chaucer uses specifically are, he's a perfect gentle knight, and that would again be in Middle English. He is courageous. He is the epitome of what being noble and honorable should be. He actually wears his armor on the trip because it's really a part and parcel of who he happens to be. And because he is wealthy and distinguished, he is going to be one of the few pilgrims actually riding a horse to Canterbury while many of the others are walking. His son is with him, the squire. The squire is almost like a joke of a character because he is portrayed as being exceptionally prissy and effeminate. He is the son of the knight. He wins a lot of jousts and contests. We see he enters a lot of tournaments for knights in training, and he's very good at it. But in terms of actual fighting, he has not seen any fighting yet. And part of that is because he is so young. He is a playboy. He loves women. He is always trying to, get new girlfriends. He does so with his music. He actually brings his instrument with him. I think it's a lyre, and he plays music and sings a lot. He is very young and handsome. He has curly hair, and Chaucer says it looks as if it's been pressed, so he literally curls his blonde hair. He's also wearing a short tunic, which, when you read, doesn't really seem to mean much of anything, except it very much does. In the Middle Ages, the length of a man's tunic was often correlated directly with his manhood. And so if he was young and virile and fit, then he wanted to show off his strong calf muscles and such. If he was older, pudgier, not in the best condition, then his tunic would have been longer because you don't want the women to see, those legs. And so the fact that the squire is wearing an exceptionally short tunic is indicative that he's trying to show off how fit his legs are, but that he's also trying to show off other attributes. And I'll let you figure that one out for yourselves. The prioress, I'm not going in order. You're going to notice I'm not going to go over every single pilgrim. I'm only going to go over the major ones. The prioress is a head nun of a priory. She's very young. It says in the story that she is basically curvaceous. She has gray eyes and red lips. She's very dainty and feminine. She's wearing jewelry, which she should not be wearing as a nun, but she is. She's wearing coral and jade beads. It says that she has a forehead a hand's breadth high, if you look at the story, at the prologue. And in the Middle Ages, if your forehead was very high, you could actually put your hand up there and your hand kind of covered your forehead. That was a mark of beauty. So to have a high forehead meant you were beautiful in the Middle Ages. Go figure. And then we're told that she's wearing a brooch that has a letter A inscribed upon it. And there's the expression, love conquers all, on it as well. This is interesting. If she is a nun, she should not be wearing a token of secular love, and she is. The only jewelry she would have been permitted to wear at that time would have actually been a gold band, much like a wedding band, that would have signified her marriage to Christ. And so instead, she is wearing a love token from someone. We don't know why she's wearing it, and we don't know where she gets it from, but clearly she has been sent off to a nunnery on purpose. And in this time period, wealthy families could procure positions within the church for their children. More than likely, she has gotten into trouble of some kind, and her family has shipped her off to become the head of a priory. It's clear that she has had a secular lifestyle if she's wearing this jewelry. She also speaks a very dainty, specific dialect of French, and so she has been educated somewhere, possibly at a finishing school for girls. The Pardoner is one of my favorites because the Pardoner basically does not try to hide who he is. He's this real skinny, choleric looking guy. If you look at the picture there, he just looks creepy. He has stringy blonde hair and these big, bulging, rat-like eyes. He speaks with an incredibly high-pitched voice. And Chaucer even says it was hard to tell if he was a gelding or a mare. And in the Middle Ages, an expression like that would have indicated that perhaps he was gay, believe it or not. And so he is riding along at times with the summoner, who is his buddy on the trip. The summoner has no idea what kind of guy the pardoner is. The pardoner's job in the church would have been literally to sell pardons. And so what that meant was that if you had committed some kind of a sin, you could go to a pardoner, confess your sin, and then pay a price. And the pardoner would then say a prayer with you and pardon or forgive your sins. And so the pardoner makes a very wealthy living overcharging people by hearing their pardons and then keeping a bulk of the money for himself and not giving it to the church. This is where those indulgences in the church appear, and you hear about indulgences in the Catholic Church. And so what that means is that money was overcharged to people to confess their sins. Indulgences were also like the prioress who, she's had a position bought for her. And so she doesn't earn it and she doesn't genuinely want to be a nun, but her family is rich and they can buy her a position like that. We also see the pardoner tell a story called an exemplum. An exemplum is a moral story and it has very much religious undertones within it. If you look at the picture and you see the green and the brown sashes worn by the pardoner, he also sells religious relics that are fake, and he tries to sell them to the pilgrims on the trip. And he would say something like, this splinter of wood came from the cross, or this bone is the bone of a saint, and he would overcharge people for this. And he would specifically target the, more uneducated of the people he was, selling pardons to. And he actually is going to brag when he's done telling his story. He's going to say, and even though I've told you all these are fake relics, you all are so stupid, I'll bet you'll buy them from me anyway. And it kind of starts a little mob riot there on the trip. Next, you have the miller, who's one of my favorites as well. He does have a name, Robin the Miller. He is a Scotsman. He's red-haired. He's got this big bushy red beard and this huge wart on his nose that's sprouting little red hairs. He's playing the bagpipes on the trip. He also brags about being this great wrestler who can rip door frames out of buildings. And he's a complete and total drunk. And he's hysterical because he doesn't care what anyone thinks of him or the story that he happens to tell. On this trip, the miller and the reeve are going to disagree a lot. A reeve is kind of like a carpenter, but the miller doesn't care that the reeve dislikes him because he's this happy-go-lucky guy. He doesn't care what other people think. And it's interesting because for the miller to be so incredibly drunk, he tells one of the best stories on the entire trip. And he makes fun of so many different people. He makes fun of the clerk, he makes fun of the wife of Bath, and he makes fun of the reeve. And he tells this really complicated, hilarious fabliau, which is kind of like a funny, dirty little story. And it's so brilliant, but he's drunk. As a matter of fact, by the time he's finished telling it, he literally falls off his horse because he's so drunk, and they leave him on the roadside, and he'll have to catch up with him later. Next, we have the wife of Bath. This is a woman who's been married 5 times, and she's from Bath, so that's why she's called the wife of Bath. Her name is Alison, and she's a weaver or a cloth maker. She makes dresses. You notice her dress is very fancy. You can't see it in the picture there, but in most depictions, the wife of Bath is wearing red stockings, which would have been, one, scandalous for the Middle Ages because that color would not have been an appropriate color for a lady to wear, but also because they would have been very expensive. That red cloth would have been very expensive, the red dye. And so for her to wear red stockings was shocking, one, because it wasn't appropriate, but also because it showed off her wealth. She was very wealthy. Each of her husbands left vast money to her. She laughs and says she's actually in the market for her sixth husband. She has gapped teeth, which I know that sounds ridiculous, like that would be a mark of beauty in the Middle Ages, but it was. And so it said that she had these gapped teeth, and that, in her younger years, she was a very beautiful woman. She tells a very controversial story, which I have you guys reading about a night. And one of the big discussions that comes with the wife of Bath is her story a feminist one? Or is her story more misogynist? Like, what exactly is she doing with it? Because she tells the story, to be the strong, independent woman, she tells a story that kind of goes against the very theme of her life. Next, we have the summoner. This is the guy the pardoner is riding with at times. The summoner is another church official. He would have actually summoned people to come to church who had not come to hear prayer or have mass, or people who had not come to confess in a while. He would actually go and get them. So you see him, it looks like he's got a little summons there from the court or from the church. We're told that he loves garlic and leeks and he smells of them. He has a face covered with acne pockmarks, and it's really nasty looking. He's this large, burly guy. We're told that the black beard on his face looks as if moths have eaten away at it. And apparently he's got the STDs, quite a few of them. And so he is just really a gross figure. We're told that he knew lots of barmaids, and you have to wonder why he's going to Canterbury. Next, we have the monk, another one of the corrupt church officials. If you look at the monk's picture right off, you see that he's in direct violation of what the church would have called for. He is not gaunt and pale. He is fat. It says that his head is as brown as a berry because he's been out in the sun. He's been hunting, not in the darkness and in prayer. His robes are covered in fur and gold and jewels, and he has spurs on his sandals, which are very expensive and imported. And we find out that he eats very expensive foods and very gourmet foods, which he should not do. He actually has his greyhound hunting dogs with him, so this is indicative of what he would rather be doing at any point, but he's going on the pilgrimage, I guess, as just a show. We're also told that the monk was a hunter of the hare, and in the Middle Ages, hare in this sense was a slang term for female anatomy. So if he's a hunter of the hare, I'll let you figure out what it is that he hunts. Next, we have the reeve. The reeve is old, gaunt, pale, sickly. He is a former carpenter. He is a very serious man. He doesn't care for jokes. He doesn't care for dirty riddles. He doesn't care for drinking. And so he and the miller immediately dislike each other. He is going to, in his story, he tries to get back at the miller, but I don't know that he ever quite gets back at him the way that the miller makes so much fun of him in his own tale. Next, we have the merchant. The merchant is very rich. The merchant is also very unhappy. He has gotten married recently, and he absolutely hates his wife. And he tells a story about this terrible, unfaithful wife. It's actually a quite funny story. It's a fablio as well. If you notice the different colors on the merchant, you see that his wealth is indicated with the red and the purple and the blue, which would have been your most expensive fabrics or dyes, even now, but let alone in the Middle Ages. And so the merchant, to have everything, is miserable. And so he is proof that money does not buy happiness. There are lots of other pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. These are the main ones that I wanted to go over with you. And so you're going to get so much out of the time period and the history of the time period really through reading the tales that I assigned for you guys to do. And so let's talk about those tales for just a brief minute here. The ones that you had to do. So I assigned you guys to read The Pardoner's Tale, which again is an exemplum, The Miller's Tale. I assigned for you to read The Merchant's Tale and The Wife of Bath's Tale. And there may have been one or two more that are listed in Canvas if you just go there and check. Pace yourselves because they are lengthy. You may want to email me specific questions that you might have just so you can clarify, what's happening. The discussion board that you had dealt with Chaucer's view of women. And so there's this long debate by critics about Chaucer and how he views women. And there are many who feel that Chaucer is a misogynist and that, you look at the female characters he creates in the general prologue, and then you also look at them in the stories that they then tell afterward, and he's this just terrible misogynist. And then you have others who say, no, he's actually a strong feminist. And so if you look at the women, they're actually far stronger than you think they are, and so forth. So I want to see what you guys think of Chaucer and his view of women in the discussion board. This has just been a very, very brief overview of Chaucer, of his life, and of the Canterbury Tales. And I could have gone on all day about this. I took an entire class on Chaucer, and most of the class dealt with the Canterbury Tales. And honestly, I feel like we only scratched the surface in that class. If you have any questions after this video, please email me. And I look forward to seeing you guys soon.